we're wanting. If you measure a Manly or anybody's valves, they're not perfect. And for our seal to work, it had to be closer than what they were. So we've kind of scratched that. We've gone to using the Viton seal. On some street motors, we'll recommend restricting the PCV valve a little bit. Down to a 62 thousandths orifice because of the increased vacuum with the Taiwan tin valve covers, no baffling. We were sucking oil right through. So basically in the catalog there's a lot of information that you can read when you get back to the motel. My card's in there. The poster's the same as the one here. And I guess I'll open it up to any questions that I can answer. Yes?
What does a V8 normally run at vacuum?
All depends on the camshaft. You'll see them anywhere from 12 to 20.
My 2.2 is doing 18, just so you know.
Have you got total seals in it?
I don't know, whatever I bought from Ed.
I got total seals too, and I'm running 18.
Okay.
Run about 13 stock, 13, 14 stock. One stock.
Anybody got any questions or? Okay.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Another crawler?
Can I have a question? Greg, what do ring builders recommend for braking procedures on their piston rings?
Basically, what I'm going to tell you is put standard 1030 oil in, whatever flavor you like. If it's a street motor, 500 miles, 1,000 miles, it's going to be seated up. I'm real familiar with building sprint car motors, and if I didn't have access to a dyno, what we would do would be fresh motor, it'd go through a couple of cycles at the show, retorque the heads and that. We'd take it to the track, we'd run one session of hot laps, keeping the RPM low, only turn up to about 5,000 and up and down easily. Then our next session of hot laps, we race. And do not use synthetic oils until the motor has been totally seated up on a street motor, probably 3,000 miles. And I was talking to Ed earlier, and he said, well, race motor probably 100 miles.
What did Callaway and Shelby do when they sold their cars with mobile
Motors already broken.
They were dynoed motors.
Okay.
Really? They're a dyno motor?
Every engine that Chrysler builds goes across to running static now.
For how long?
Maybe
What's
a
your
minute,
opinion on?
Maybe a minute. But that's sufficient to break a moly ring. You get the right cross hatch, right frictional coefficient of that ring to the cylinder wall. It's broke in 5 minutes.
Very
30
seldom,
seconds, really. Chrome ring is a tough one to see.
very seldom do you see a smoker anymore, when you fire them up.
What's your opinion on a ball hone versus a flat stone?
I like a ball hone because of the plateau finish.
And
Which
how
means
much,
the peaks that he's talking about are getting rounded off. You don't have a real abrasive surface there.
how much lubrication do you like to see on assembly?
Very little on the walls, none on the rings. Little on the skirt of the piston.
Like little meaning?
Pat it on with your hand. You squirt it on with an oil can and you just pat it.
Yeah. Not the old school where you took your piston upside down, dumped it in a can of oil and put it in. No. No, just a little wiped on the wall and that's it.
Let me take a minute and introduce some people that we got with us today. First off, let's say thanks to the two guys that really put an effort that brought us all together. Patrick, I want you to stand up, and Christopher.
This gets an extra ovation for taking on almost all of this.
John Johnson, stand up. John is president of SDAC. What are the celebrities in here? Doug Saliva, get your butt up in the air. This is an SCCA solo champion. Okay? Driving a GLHS. Okay? let's go to something that's near and dear to our hearts that, boy, everybody loves to get our adrenaline flowing. So what kind of oil should I use, petroleum-based or synthetic? What's that proverb I use, John?
There's no such thing as magic in a can.
One more time.
There is no such thing as magic in a can.
No such thing as magic in a can. You guys ever watch that Petrolong demonstration?
Yeah.
Comes on about 3 o'clock in the morning, and they got the old Chrysler 318, and the guy's pouring sand through the damn thing. You know?
I'm using a 350
How does the federal, the one that gets me is they're out here, they got, does Al Unser Sr. that hard up for money, where he's got to sit in a Viper? Now, you're mechanical, right? Every engine that Chrysler builds has got hydraulic lash adjusters in it. And he's sitting there in this Viper, and he says, this is miraculous. This is the quietest engine I've ever heard, and there's no oil in it. What is keeping the hydraulic valve lash adjusters quiet when there's no oil in it? Okay? The Federal Trade Commission needs to talk to somebody and do some investigations, because that is deceptive advertising. And then they take these vehicles out and they run them theoretically with no oil. That's deceptive advertising. I don't think they can go that far. Particularly with no lash noise. Because you don't run an engine that's got hydraulic lash adjusters in it, and everything we build has got hydraulic lash adjusters in it. So don't believe what you see, and remember the proverb. There's no such thing as magic in a can. Everybody get their fingers and try to put them, I want everybody to do this now. Everybody get their thumb and their forefinger and just get a gap between it, just where you can barely see between it. That's the difference between petroleum-based and synthetic, as far as its slipperiness or its lubrosity. Okay? The difference in synthetic blended oil is the additive pack that goes into it that keeps it from changing viscosity. Okay? Remember the Mobil commercial? And it was on TV for a long time where they're pouring Mobil 1 synthetic base into a frying pan, and then they're pouring the common denominator oil into the other frying pan. They said at 400 degrees, it turns black. What happens to common denominator petroleum-based oil is about 250 in the pan. Its viscosity starts getting thicker. And when it hits about 275, you got 60 weight oil. When it hits about 280, you got about 90 weight oil. Now, how good is oil going to lubricate when it's 90 weight? Everybody in this room, and a lot of people think that 1550 lubricates better than 5W30. You know that most Winston Cup cars run 0W30 engine oil for 500 miles around that track? And very few of them, probably zero, run 1550. Most of them run 0W30. I want you to think about something for a minute. Going through thick oil, if we have thick oil, it's like putting on 2 coats. It doesn't dissipate heat, so the oil is going to retain the heat. If oil is thicker, it's not going to get in places to lubricate that thicker oil can't get to. So thinner oil is going to lubricate better than thicker oil. And thinner oil works better in hydraulic valve tappets and controls them better than thick weight oils. Now, what I said about, what's the proverb again, John?
There's no such thing as magic in a can.
If we could get the engine, and we could build a barrier between the crankshaft and the bottom end of the engine and the pistons, then we could sit down, and there's oils out there. I got the Petroleum Research Center of Pennzoil right up the street from my shop. And I went in there one time, and this is going back about 3 or 4 years ago before I retired from Chrysler. And I took the whole staff from the Houston zone office in there, all the guys that were the tech advisors and all the guys that were district managers and so on and so forth. And we went through a tour. And it was then a product by the name of Slick 50 had first come out. And believe me, it's not hard to sit down and do a spectrograph analysis of anybody's product and see what the hell's in it. I can sit down and with a spectrograph, and I can sludge this thing out, spin it out, and find all the various chemicals that are in it in probably about 15 minutes. So there's no such thing as having a magic formula. Okay? And they're in there testing some Slick 50. This is right when it first hit the market. And a little Pakistani guy who happened to be the head chemist that was sitting there boy, he hit it on the head. And he says, oh, you know, I can't talk back steady, but you know, that accent that they got. And he says, oh, he says, you know, this stuff is great. He says, I know how it got its name. He says, the guy that sold this, and the guy that bought 2 cans of it, the guy that sold it made a slick 50. I thought, wow, that's unbelievable. Anyway, let's get back to our little division between the engine. We got a separation, and Greg is going to get a bang out of this for just a minute, because if we could separate the engine, and we could get down into the bottom end and the bottom end only, there's products out there that Pennzoil and Mobil and everybody else has got, okay, that's used in the aerospace industry, that's slicker than hell. I mean, this stuff, you could theoretically run the car around with no oil in it, okay, and do the Petrolon commercial and do it legitimately. But the problem you run into is going back to this, and that's why I had you do it. Because all the slipperiness down below what we've gained, now we've lost the compromise of the sealability on our piston rings. What we've gained down below in slipperiness, say we gained 10 horsepower, we've lost in sealability on our piston rings because we made it so slick, now the rings won't seal. Correct? Greg?
We've had people try to break in a motor on Mobil 1 and call and just horror stories.
Horror stories. The difference in petroleum-based oils and the difference in synthetics, as far as its increase in lubrosity, how much slicker it is. Go back to that when you go home tonight, and that's the difference, okay? The big difference in this stuff is when it hits 300, let's go back 250 degrees. And you guys will see 250 at times. I used to see 335 in my Shelby cars on the road race track. 335 degrees. I was getting lift aeration. How many, what was the question you asked me before?
Yeah.
Say it again to me.
They start clacking.
They start clacking. What's the clacking from? It's the aeration of the oil. And this stuff has a strong tendency to reduce that. It does not foam. Okay? And I'm not promoting Mobil as any of your synthetics, but the big difference in oils is that this stuff, the additive pack in it doesn't go, and let's look at oil for just a minute. This is not a 100% container of oil. It's not even if it's a synthetic, it's not 100%. They have to put additive packs in there called zinc thiophosphate, which is a friction inhibitor, 1/10 of 1%. Etch that in your gray matter for just a second, 1/10 of 1%. And then about another 9% is viscosity indexers. These are chemicals that go into the oil that lets the oil molecule be flexible. Okay, that's what makes multi-viscosity oil. The worst wear factor in your engine is not from running at 100 miles an hour. Rick can go out there with all these cars and run them stinkers once they're at temperature and run them month after month after month after month, and if no mechanical componentry broke down, you would probably never have negligible wear in the motor. Because with hydraulic lubrication, the parts are floating on oil films. So there's nothing touching nothing. What wears an engine out is when you start it up cold. That's the worst detriment to a motor. And most pro racers, you'll see their engines are preheated. When I used to go out to the racetracks with mine, I had a Black Heath blanket. I had a magnetic blanket that actually sat on the bottom of my pan. And I would fire up a generator, and I'd plug that stinker in. And when I saw 140 degrees, then it was time to start my engine. And etch that in your gray matter now. Another one, 140 degrees. If you guys don't have a pan that shows pan temperatures, you got to be real careful in some northern climates, particularly up there where Kenny's at in Canada. Some of you guys up in Washington, it's pretty cold during the winter. Basically what the indexers do is it does take away some of our virgin stock of oil. So you've got to have an oil that where it bends the oil molecule to where it gets into places when you start that motor that you don't create false wear. And that's the worst time, the worst phase of an engine operation is in cold startup. And that's what a lot of you guys are, I mean, Daddy used 30 weight oil. My race car guy down the street that built my engine says I use nothing but 30 weight oil. Well, that's fine. If you want to use 100% oil, well, let's call it 99% oil, because even 100% oil still has got zinc thiophosphate in it. 1/10 of 1%. Remember that? Remind me in just a minute. Okay, why we have to put that in there. because it is a corrosion and friction inhibitor, okay? And it's also putting magic in a can, okay? Make the oil stock a little bit slicker. If you have a heating blanket to where you start the car and your oil's at 140 degrees, then you don't need multi-viscosity. But if you guys are anti-multi-viscosity, thinking that straight weight oil is better than multi-viscosity, you better go back and revise your thinking. This took me some education because I came through many generations of, I had 27 years with Chrysler before I retired. And it took me a while to get my thinking straight on straight weight oil versus multi-viscosity. And the toughest one I had was jumping up to the synthetics. But the synthetics don't break down under temperature. Let's go with this temperature thing for just a minute. Say you're out there in the middle of the summer racing like John does with the GLHS, and if he doesn't have a temperature gauge or a pan temperature gauge in there and say he's seeing 220 degrees in the pan, 250, that's not unheard of. When I road raced in a good road race car, you're going to see oil temperatures that parallel water temperature. So you're going to see 220, 220, and that's where she makes horsepower. Don't make horsepower at 160 degrees. You guys are dumping 160 thermostats in there. You ain't making horsepower. You make horsepower with heat, and that's around 220. Okay? You guys can go out and put any oil on it you want, but synthetic is the way to go. Okay? This will go in and lubricate in places that petroleum-based won't. It's got better shear characteristics. Yes.
I got a question.
Shoot.
Heat transfer,
Yes.
is there the synthetic and the petroleum?
Heat transfer is going to be about the same.
About the
okay?
same?
About the same. The difference is the thinner weight oil will dissipate the heat quicker because it has less of a blanket thickness around it. Okay?
Okay.
The thinner weight oil will get into places the thicker weight oil can't get into. So it will lubricate better.
More surface area.
The thinner weight oil will hold a better shear against two parts against one another than a thicker weight oil will. Believe it or not, the shear resistance where you create friction between two parts, that's called shear, okay, is better with a thinner weight oil than a thick weight oil. So this ought to dispel any thoughts that you have of 1550 under your race car. Plus you will make more horsepower with 0W30 or 5W30 oil than you will 1550.
A couple of years ago when I was racing motorcycles, the Neo Zero Weight came out.
Yes.
And everybody was like, Zero Weight, no. Well, I was sponsored by Neo, and what happened is when they gave that, everyone was kind of taboo about it. But when our training, we tried it, and we found out that the bikes made about 3 more horsepower due to thinner oil. And we would go out and run 30, 40-minute endurance races, and come back in, and the bike wouldn't be clattering. And when they tore down at the end of the season, the bearings were just beautiful, and everybody. And our race guy, our manager, he was from the old school. He was like, well, let's put this such oil in here. And he was one of the major people against our team using the zero weight, but his thoughts changed real quick when he
Old
pulled the
theories are
first
really
motor.
tough to dump, particularly out of your own brain. That's the toughest one. Now let's go back to what we just said before. Hang on a second. Remember we said 1/10 of 1% zinc phosphate? Slick 50 is located in Houston. That's where I home base right now. Okay, my last job assignment before I retired with Chrysler is I handle a lot of the Mexico stuff. And I worked out of the Houston zone office, so I home based in Houston. And it just so happens that's the oil capital of the world. And a lot of these guys, for some reason, like to call me on the phone and come over and, hey, Ed, would you endorse this? Or, if you look at that. A good friend of mine who I used to race with is one of the petroleum engineers that works for Slick 50. They hired a petroleum engineer just for his credentials. And when I go over there, they mix Slick 50, and usually this stuff is mixed in a 10,000-gallon vat. Okay? And what is Slick 50? It's nothing more than cheap paraffin-based oil as its base stock. And they pour in a solid that has been chopped into microscopic pieces of Teflon. If you ever bought a frying pan with Teflon liner in it, that's nothing more than the PTFE that's added to that base stock oil. It is a solid. It is manufactured by DuPont. DuPont does not recommend that it be used in any type of an internal combustion motor, but yet it's sold by the truckload and the train load every day. Okay? What it basically is, it's laid out straight out on a sheet, and maybe the thickness of 4 or 5 thousandths, and then it is shredded up into many, many microscopic particles. And it does have the ability to go back and solidify in a motor. And that's what Slick 50 is. Plus they add 0.1% of zinc diophosphate. Okay? What is 0.1% in a 10,000 gallon vat? It's a 5 gallon pail. We have very few people in Houston now, much less Texas, that speak English. And we can hire them for minimum wage. And there's no automatic adders of 5 gallons of zinc diophosphate. The guy goes over to another drum, he's got his 5 gallon pail, he goes and fills it up with zinc diophosphate, he climbs the stairs up into this 10,000 gallon vat, and he pours this stuff in. Hey, Jose, come here, time to lunch. Jose goes back down, here comes Hector. Hey, Jose, did you put, zinc diophosphate in? No, I don't think so, senor. So another one goes in there, okay? Now we got 0.2%. When that particular commodity increases by 0.1%, now we have, instead of a friction inhibitor and a corrosion inhibitor, now we've got a corrosive stock of oil that in most instances never goes through a qualitative check. And just think about what I just said for a minute. The differences between cheap base stock oil, like Pennzoil or Mobil or whatever, when they mix up 20,000 gallons, there's a sample of that goes back in the lab, and they qualitatively test it against a window. Hey, this is the spectrum that it has to work in. Do you think that Slick 50 does that? They have the money to do it. So now we've got a base stock of oil that's going out with 0.2% zinc diophosphate. 50% more than what it should have. And it goes into John's motor. And John runs this thing, and now he's got a corrosive base in there. And it eats the surface of the bearings out. And John's motor fails. What's John going to blame that failure on? I bought a crap set of Cleve-like bearings, or that guy that machined my crank didn't machine it right. The wrong failure analysis. And it's tough to go back and look downstream, and that's what I used to do with Chrysler. I was a product failure analysis, and I was supposedly an expert in every aspect of the car, and that's tough to go back and sit down with a design engineer and say, what you designed, Rick, is a piece of crap. We got to change things. I just call this baby ugly, okay? You know, you ought to see these guys go nuts on you, particularly after they spent 2 or 3 years of their life designing the door hinge, and the door hinge has failed. I'm telling them the door hinge ain't worth a crap. Okay? Particularly when you have false accusations. You better know what you're talking about when you look at something and you accuse some guy of designing something ugly, or wrong, or indifferent, or bad, or whatever. Okay? But that's what happens. Most of the time when you guys go out and look at your massive engine destruction that you created, you say, the bearings went bad. Or you go call Greg up on the phone and say, your rings ain't worth a crap. Because you didn't diagnose it. You didn't follow that river from an ocean all the way down to a creek. Okay? And that's a tough one to do, particularly when maybe you're not as mechanically astute as you think you are. So that's what you got to be careful of, is chemical incompatibility. And we said it before. What's the proverb again, John?
No such thing as magic in a can.
When you take an aspirin for a headache, what does it say on the back of the aspirin bottle? It may upset your stomach. Okay? The same thing holds true when you put magic in a can in your motor. It don't work. Use a good known synthetic blend. Start a fresh engine with the thinnest weight oil that you can. Use a known base stock like Mobil 1, not Mobil 1, but Mobil base, Pennzoil, whatever. After a couple 100 miles, switch it back over to your synthetic. Oil gets just as dirty as it did 10 years ago as it did now. So those old oil change intervals, what we look at, and when I was with Chrysler, is that most people keep a car 2.5 years. That's what we analyzed, about 2.5 years. And in 2.5 years, he puts maybe 20, 25,000, 32,000 miles on it. If he only changes the oil at 7,500 miles, he's only changed the oil maybe 3 or 4 times, so he looks at his overall expense factor on that vehicle. If we told him we had to change it every 3,000 miles, we'd have all the environmentalists screaming that you're using too much oil from Iraq, okay? And we got better filters on the cars now than we did then. The engines might seal, let's go back to that closed finger thing again, about that much better than what they did 10 years ago, but we still got an internal combustion engine with worse fuel now than we ever had. The fuel modifiers that are in gasoline right now creating this stuff. This guy was stupid, but still, it creates some of this stuff, okay? Because the fuel that our engines have to ingest is trying to be more environmentally friendly. So if we want to make a performance engine, you guys may have to sit down and buy $3.50 a gallon stuff to make your cars run right, or you're going to see this stuff. And you say, Peter sold me a bad set of pistons. Talk about oil filters for just a minute. You got a question? And John? And
Me.
oh my God. Who's first? You were first.
I was just wondering how many people use Slick 50 in their cars.
I have.
Well, not Slick 50,
Not in this one.
And then pulled your oil in once. I had an octopus in the bottom of my family.
Solidified MTBFE. Exactly.
I'm trying to figure out what happened. I had an oil change recently where I've been running a 1050 or 1550 with hot ones there, and they put in a 530. Car kept stalling and anything at idle. Changed it back. Idle was right again and no overheat.
I find it hard to identify how changing the weights of oil would have anything.
Well, I can't tell. One of the screens.
Why do most most oil companies that sell, quote, race oil, always sells it 1550?
Because the old school adage still thinks the thicker's better.
And they gotta sell it.
Yeah,
And they gotta
thicker's
sell it.
better. No, but how many guys still believe that non-variable weight oil, okay, straight weight oil is the way to go? How many guys agree? Honestly, there's Rick right there. Here's Chrysler engineer.
No, it's interesting. Porsche for a long time would not warranty their
Yeah.
911 engine.
Air cooled. They want straight weight.
My
straight weight oil.
compressor, a 5-horse compressor made by Tecumseh, and it says I must use non-detergent oil. Try to go out and find that. You know, I think the only place they still live was about 1945.
Old Price still wants non-detergent.
My new engine I have 530. Should I go to 030?
I would.
Do you recommend 030 all year round?
I sure do. Unless, you know, it's like anything else. If I've got a temperature probe in my pan, okay, and I make oil pans, I'm not promoting my oil pan, okay, but I sell it to you guys when you buy a pan from me, and the one thing I do supply, and it costs me about $15 to do this, is I put a temperature probe in right there, right alongside where the drain plug is, okay? Now, when I sell it to you, I always go back in and put a pipe plug in it, because everybody calls me up and says, what do you got that stupid goddamn thing on there for, and I can't find a plug to go in it and block it off. I said, it's there for a purpose. So you will purposely go and put a temperature probe in there. Before you start humping your motor, you better see 140 degrees or you're going to cause premature wipe out of the bearings. But I couldn't tell you how many guys call me up and are unhappy with that.
Oh, the oil won't turn out.
Yeah, that's what the drain holes there for.
You fill it up to that level.
It's like your differential, huh?
It runs out.
How long, if you have a car that you've been, you know, it's got some miles in it, 50,000, 60,000, whatever.
There's no such thing anymore as Pennsylvania-based oils and Texas-based oils. Everybody refines oils now, basically with the same amount of sulfur base, okay? They said that Pennsylvania oils at one time were low sulfur base and Texas oils were high sulfur base. When they go through the refractory process, they come out exactly the same. It might take 3 seconds more, 3 minutes more of refining to get that Texas crude that's high sulfur based into a low sulfur base like Pennsylvania crude.
What I was asking was, if you already have it, you know, my wife's got an LHS, and it's got,
And changing brands and creating problems.
yeah, can I go ahead and?
I wouldn't think there's, yeah, there's soldiers, yeah, I wouldn't think there'd be any kind of problem whatsoever. You might initially see a little bit of an additive pack change, okay? Like taking a generic drug versus a prescription drug, it might be just a fraction off, okay? You might see a possible washout of the old varnishing, and you might see a couple increase in oil consumption, maybe a quart or two, if you don't change it for 75 miles. You might see that.
On that switching brands footnote, going back to using a standard conventional motor oil for break-in and then switching to synthetic, Now, from what I've heard from people who've done it, that's like, it causes more things to leak. Is that true, not true?
Viscosity